Picture this. 17 million beings drifting to the cold darkness of space, their massive ships barely holding together. These weren't pirates or criminals. The Kethrans had been model citizens of the stellar Concord for centuries. Their crime? They refused to strip mine worlds where primitive life was just starting to crawl out of the oceans. Captain Zethkar pressed his four-fingered hand against the observation deck's cold metal, watching another transport ship go dark in the distance. That was the 7th one this month. Inside that hulking piece of metal, 3,000 Kethran families had just lost their artificial gravity, their water recyclers, their hope. He could see the tiny emergency lights flickering like dying stars against the ship's hull, and he knew those lights would be gone by morning. 3 years since the exile began, and they were dying ship by ship. The Concord had been efficient in their cruelty. They didn't execute the Kethrans outright. That would have made martyrs of them. Instead, they stripped away their citizenship, their right to docket stations, their access to trade routes and fuel depots. They turned 17 million beings into galactic ghosts, drifting through space with nowhere to land. Zethkar remembered the day it all started. His science team had discovered a water world in the Vega system, teeming with early oceanic life, microscopic organisms that might, in a few million years, evolve into something magnificent. The Concord's orders were simple: harvest the rare minerals from the ocean floor. The fact that this would boil away the seas and kill every living thing was just an unfortunate side effect of progress. But his people had refused. They looked at those tiny life forms swimming in alien seas and seen something the Concord couldn't: potential. Hope. A future that deserved protection. For that moment of compassion, they'd been branded as traitors to galactic civilization. Every world they approached slammed their doors shut. The Andromedans wouldn't even let them enter their system. The Rigel Collective fired warning shots across their bow. The message from the galaxy was crystal clear: show mercy to the weak, and you become weak yourself. Compassion was a disease that had to be quarantined. Zethkar's youngest daughter, Kiravel, had died last month when the medical bay ran out of the synthetic proteins her body needed. She was only 43 years old in human terms, barely a teenager by Kethran standards. As he held her cooling hand, she'd whispered, "Papa, why won't anyone help us?" He hadn't known what to tell her then. He still didn't know now. His communication officer, Thekmar, had been monitoring distress frequencies for months, hoping to find other outcasts, other refugees who might understand their situation. Instead, they found nothing but silence. The galaxy had closed its ears to their suffering. But then their long-range sensors picked up something strange. A system on the rim, completely absent from Concord databases. It shouldn't have been possible. The Concord had mapped every star system within 50,000 light-years. Yet here was a G-type star with multiple planets, and one of them was pulsing with electromagnetic activity that suggested advanced civilization. Thekmar burst onto the bridge, his usually composed demeanor shattered by excitement. "Captain, you need to hear this. The third planet, it's broadcasting." Zethkar followed him to the communication station, expecting to hear the usual territorial warnings or trade negotiations that marked most inhabited worlds. Instead, his translator struggled with dozens of different languages, all coming from the same small blue-green planet. Mathematical sequences mixed with what could only be described as artistic expression. And strangest of all, they were broadcasting music into space. Not territorial warnings, not trade negotiations, not threats or demands. Just music. Pure, purposeless music sent out into the void, as if these beings actually believed someone might be listening. Someone who might want to hear something beautiful instead of profitable. "They're not talking to anyone specific," Thekmar said, his voice full of wonder. "It's like they're just hoping someone's out there, someone who might want to be friends." Zethkar stared at the readings. In all his centuries of space travel, he'd never encountered anything like this. Every spacefaring species followed the same basic rules: establish dominance, secure resources, expand territory. These humans seemed to be doing something completely different. They were reaching out to the universe with open hands instead of closed fists. "Set course of the system," he ordered, his hearts beating faster than they had in months. "And prepare a message. Tell them we're refugees seeking sanctuary. As their failing ships limped toward this mysterious world called Earth, Zethkar dared to feel something he thought had died with his daughter. Hope. Maybe, just maybe, there was still room in the universe for those who chose mercy over might. When human ships approached the Kethrin fleet, Admiral Beth Crawford didn't ask about their political status or what they could offer in return. She saw 17 million souls in distress and did what humans do. She helped. Beth had been tracking the alien vessel for 3 days as they limped into the outer solar system. Her tactical officer kept running threat assessments, but Beth wasn't looking at weapon signatures or shield arrays. She was looking at the life support readings, and what she saw broke her heart. Ships going dark one by one. Emergency power flickering on vessels that looked like they'd been held together with hope and spare parts. "Ma'am, we don't know anything about their intentions," her aide Tom Rodriguez warned as he handed her the latest intelligence reports. They could be scouts for an invasion force. Beth looked at him with the kind of expression that had earned her 3 stars and the loyalty of every sailor under her command. "Tom, look at those ships. Really look at them. Does that look like an invasion force to you? Those people are dying out there." Within the hour, she'd mobilized every vessel in the Earth Defense Fleet, but not for war, for rescue. "Get me every cargo hauler we've got," she told Tom as they watched the massive Kethrin vessels struggling to maintain formation. "I don't care if they're carrying groceries or garbage. We've got people dying out here, and I'll be damned if we're going to sit around writing reports while that happens." The first human ship to dock with a Kethrin vessel was a converted mining hauler called a Lucky Strike, captained by a gruff asteroid miner named Frank Wilson. Frank had been hauling ice from the Jupiter system when the call went out, and he diverted course without a second thought. His ship wasn't fancy, but it had something the Kethrins desperately needed: working life support systems and a cargo hold full of emergency supplies. When Frank's airlock cycled open and he came face to face with Captain Zethkar, neither of them spoke the other's language. But Frank took one look at the alien captain's exhausted eyes and did something that will be talked about for generations. He took off his own emergency oxygen pack and handed it to a young Kethrin who was clearly struggling to breathe. The Kethrins couldn't believe it. Here was a complete stranger, a member of a species they'd never met, giving away his own life support to help them. Frank just shrugged and pointed to the spare oxygen tanks he'd brought along. "Got plenty more where that came from," he said, even though the Kethrins couldn't understand his words. His action spoke louder than any translator could. Engineer Jake Morrison was typical of the human response. Jake worked for a small tech company in Detroit, designing water filtration systems for Mars colonies. When the call went out for volunteers with engineering experience, he didn't hesitate. He found himself aboard the Kethrin flagship, working 36 hours straight to jury-rig life support systems from human components. The translation software crashed every 10 minutes, turning technical discussions into exercises in creative communication. Jake would draw diagrams on whatever surface he could find, using hand gestures and mathematical symbols to explain how human oxygen recyclers could be adapted for Kethrin biology. When words failed, he'd simply roll up his sleeves and show them, working alongside Kethrin engineers who watched in amazement as this strange human refused to give up on problems that should have been impossible to solve. "Your people," Zethkar told Jake through a barely functional translator, "they fix things that cannot be fixed." Jake wiped his grease-covered hands on his coveralls and grinned. "That's what we do best, buddy. We're really good at making stuff work that has no business working." Dr. Lisa Peterson organized medical teams that had never seen Kethrin physiology but figured out as they went. Lisa had spent her career treating human patients, but when she saw Kethrin children suffering from malnutrition, she didn't let her lack of xenobiology training stop her. She worked with Kethrin medics, comparing notes through translation programs, conducting careful experiments to figure out which human medications might help and which could be harmful. When young Vorjak, a Kethrin child who'd been unconscious for days, finally opened his eyes after receiving a modified human treatment, his parents wept with relief. They tried to give Lisa a precious family heirloom as payment, but she gently pushed it back into their hands. Just seeing him smile is payment enough, she told them. What shocked the refugees wasn't the efficiency of the human response. It was that nobody asked what was in it for Earth. No trade agreements were demanded. No territorial concessions were required. No promises of future allegiance were extracted. The humans just helped because, as President Luke Hamilton put it in his address to the world, it's what we do. Captain Zethkar found himself standing in the observation lounge of a human medical ship, watching as human doctors worked alongside his own people to save Kethran lives. These strange, chaotic, wonderful humans had taken one look at 17 million refugees and opened their hearts without asking a single question about profit or politics. For the first time in 3 years, Zethkar allowed himself to believe that maybe, just maybe, his people had found something more valuable than a safe harbor. They'd found hope. The temporary refugee camps turned into something nobody expected. Thriving communities where two species learned from each other. What started as rows of emergency shelters in the Nevada desert had transformed into a bustling town where human children played alongside young Kethrans, and where the sound of laughter echoed in languages nobody had heard before Earth opened its doors. Kethran philosopher Vexthani had spent the better part of his 300-year life trying to crack the same quantum mechanics problem. The equations that govern how consciousness might interact with quantum fields had stumped the greatest minds of his species for generations. He'd filled entire libraries with calculations, built computer models that ran for decades, and consulted with every mathematician in the stellar concord. Nothing worked. Then he met 8-year-old Sam Parker. Sam lived with her parents in the camp, where her mother worked as a nurse and her father helped coordinate supply deliveries. Like most human children, Sam had an endless curiosity about everything around her, especially the tall, blue-skinned Kethrans who spoke in musical tones and had eyes that changed color with their emotions. One afternoon, Sam wandered into the education center, where Vexthani was giving a lecture to other Kethran scholars. She watched him drawing complex diagrams on the whiteboard, his forearms moving in intricate patterns as he tried to explain concepts that had no human equivalent. But instead of being intimidated by the alien mathematics, Sam raised her hand. "That looks like a game," she announced, causing the entire room of distinguished philosophers to turn and stare at this tiny human child. Her teacher, Ms. Kate Sullivan, had been trying to make quantum physics fun for her 3rd grade class by inventing something she called quantum hopscotch. The idea was simple. Players could exist in multiple squares at once until someone observed them, at which point they collapse into a single position. It was meant to be a silly playground game, not a breakthrough in theoretical physics. But as Sam explained the rules to the increasingly fascinated Kethrans, Vexthani felt something click in his mind. The child wasn't just playing a game. She was intuitively understanding quantum superposition in a way that his species' rigid mathematical thinking had missed entirely. "Show me this hopscotch," he said, his voice trembling with excitement. Within an hour, the most respected Kethran philosopher of his generation was hopping around a playground with a bunch of human kids, and suddenly the equations that had tormented him for centuries made perfect sense. The solution had been there all along, hidden not in complex mathematics, but in the simple, playful logic of a child's game. "Your children think in patterns we cannot grasp," Vexthani told Dr. Dave Mitchell, Earth's lead xenobiologist, as they watched Sam teach quantum hopscotch to a group of young Kethrans. "They see solutions where we see only problems. Their minds are not constrained by what we tell them is impossible." Dave nodded, watching his own daughter Jenny explain to a Kethran child why you had to spin around 3 times before jumping. "That's the thing about kids," he said. "They don't know enough to know when something can't be done, so they just go ahead and do it anyway." Meanwhile, human artists like Ben Torres were discovering that everything they thought they knew about color was wrong. Ben had been painting landscapes for 20 years, always frustrated that his sunsets never quite captured what he saw in his mind. Then he met Kethera, a Kethran artist who could perceive 17 different color spectrums that humans couldn't even see. "Your species sees only a tiny slice of reality," Kethera explained as she watched Ben struggle with the painting of the desert camp at sunset. "But within that slice, you create beauty we never imagined possible." She taught him about color harmonies that existed beyond human vision, mathematical relationships between hues that human eyes couldn't detect, but human brains could somehow feel. When Ben applied these principles to his painting, using only the colors humans could see, something magical happened. His sunset suddenly captured not just the visual beauty of the moment, But the emotional weight of it, the hope, the sadness, the overwhelming sense of two species finding each other across the vastness of space. Kethrin engineers were equally amazed by what they called human intuitive problem-solving. Engineer Tom Vec had been working with human mechanic Rick Valdez to repair a water purification system that kept breaking down. By all logical analysis, the system should have worked perfectly, but it failed every few days for no apparent reason. Rick spent about 10 minutes looking at the machine, tapped it in 3 seemingly random places, adjusted a valve that according to the manual shouldn't have mattered, and somehow made it work better than it ever had. How did you know to do that? Tom Vec asked, genuinely bewildered. Rick shrugged. Just felt right, you know? Sometimes machines are like people. They don't always do what the manual says they should do. You gotta listen to them, feel what they need. This concept of feeling what an inanimate machine needed was completely foreign to Kethrin engineering, where everything followed precise calculations and predetermined protocols. But Rick's approach worked over and over again. Human engineers would walk up to problems that had stumped Kethrin experts, squint at them for a few minutes, make what seemed like random adjustments, and somehow achieve results that defied explanation. Your people, Tom Vec told Rick one evening as they watched the sunset over the camp, you solve problems with your hearts instead of your minds. Rick smiled. Maybe that's why it works. Hearts don't know when to give up. 5 years later, the Kethrin Integration Council made an announcement that would echo across the galaxy. Council Speaker Morthek stood before cameras broadcasting to 1,000 worlds. But she wasn't the same broken refugee who had arrived at Earth 5 years earlier. Her eyes held a light that hadn't been there before, and when she spoke, her voice carried the confidence of someone who had discovered something that could change everything. The broadcast began like any other diplomatic communication, with formal greetings and standard protocols. But then Morthek did something unprecedented in galactic history. She smiled. We have found something remarkable, she said, her words being translated into hundreds of languages across space. Not advanced technology or vast resources, but something rarer, a species that grows stronger through diversity, not weaker. Humans didn't just save our bodies, they saved our souls. Behind her, the camera showed images that stunned viewers across the galaxy. Kethrin children playing with human kids in Earth's first integrated schools. Scientists from both species working side by side in laboratories, their research advancing at speeds neither could have achieved alone. Artists creating masterpieces that blended human emotion with Kethrin precision, producing beauty that neither species had imagined possible. But what really shocked the galaxy was what came next. Morthek began showing footage from New Geneva, the first truly integrated city on Earth. Streets where humans and Kethrins lived as neighbors, not just as separate species sharing the same space. Shop owners of both races serving customers without a second thought about which planet they came from. Hospitals where human doctors worked alongside Kethrin healers, combining their knowledge to save lives in ways that revolutionized medicine for both species. For 3 years, we drifted through space as outcasts, Morthek continued. Every world we approached saw us as a burden, a problem to be solved or avoided. But Earth saw us as people, not resources to be exploited, not threats to be contained, but simply beings in need of help. She paused, and when she spoke again, her voice carried the weight of 17 million stories of hope reborn. They asked for nothing in return. No trade agreements, no territorial concessions, no promises of future loyalty. They helped because, in their words, it was the right thing to do. And in 5 years of living among them, we have learned that this is not weakness. It is the greatest strength any species can possess. The reaction was immediate and electric. On Proxima Station, the galaxy's largest trading hub, dock worker Danny Rodriguez watched the broadcast during his lunch break. Danny had been loading cargo for 15 years, watching ship after ship carry resources stolen from conquered worlds. He'd seen refugees turn away at gunpoint, watched families separated because their home planets had been deemed economically inefficient by the Concord. But seeing those images of Kethrins and humans working together, laughing together, building something better together, it lit fire in his chest that he hadn't felt since he was young. By the end of his shift, Danny had quietly begun organizing aid for refugees from the Rigel conflicts. He started small, just talking to other dock workers about pooling their resources to buy supplies for the refugee camps on the station's outer ring. Within a week, he had 50 volunteers. Within a month, he had 500. On the mining world Kepler, for 38B, Foreman Jack Reynolds had spent 20 years extracting rare metals from a planet inhabited by silicon-based life forms that the Concord classified as non-sentient. But after watching Morthek's broadcast, Jack started asking uncomfortable questions. If humans could see potential in supposedly primitive species, what if these crystalline beings that move so slowly they seem like rocks were actually trying to communicate? Jack began spending his off hours in the deep mines, sitting quietly near the silicon formations that his crews had been instructed to work around. And slowly, over weeks and months, he began to notice patterns in the way they pulsed with light, rhythms that seemed almost like language. The message spread like wildfire across the galaxy's communication networks. In the outer rim colonies, where workers lived under conditions that barely qualified as humane, people began asking why their masters got to live in luxury while they scraped by on the edge of survival. On the core worlds, where the wealthy had built their empires on the backs of conquered species, young people started questioning whether strength really came from domination or from lifting others up. The Andorian philosopher Zenka wrote in her journal that night, "I have spent my life believing that compassion was a luxury only the strong could afford. But these humans have shown us that compassion is what makes you strong in the first place." Across the galaxy, in hidden refugee camps and underground resistance movements, in worker dormitories and university lecture halls, the oppressed began to whisper a question that terrified the powerful. What if there was another way? The whisper was becoming a roar, and at its center stood a small blue planet that had dared to prove that a better universe was possible. The stellar Concord's response was swift and predictable. Earth represents a fundamental threat to galactic stability, declared High Chancellor Vorthax from his towering Crystal Palace on the capital world of Centaurus Prime. His words carried the cold authority of someone who had ruled 1,000 worlds for 3 centuries. This compassion doctrine must be contained before it spreads. But it was already too late. The High Chancellor had built his empire on a simple principle. Fear kept the galaxy in line. For millennia, the Concord had maintained order through overwhelming force and the threat of exile or worse. Species fell in line because resistance meant annihilation. It was a system that had worked perfectly until one small blue planet decided to prove there was another way. As Concord warships assembled for what they called Operation Containment, something unprecedented began happening across the galaxy. Commander Talvok of the Rigel Defense Fleet received his orders to join the attack on Earth and stare at them for a long time. He thought about the footage he'd seen of human children teaching Kethran youngsters to play basketball, of human doctors working around the clock to save alien lives they'd never encountered before. Then he thought about his own son, who'd been killed in one of the Concord pacification campaigns against a species whose only crime was refusing to hand over their world's water supplies. His boy had died enforcing the same system that now wanted him to destroy the first civilization in galactic history that chose mercy over might. Talvok made his choice. He broadcast a message to his entire fleet. "Any ship that wants to join me is welcome. We're going to Earth, not to attack it, but to defend it." 17 ships broke formation and followed him toward the Sol system. The defection started small, but grew into an avalanche. Captain Rita Gonzalez of the Earth Defense Force watched her tactical displays in amazement as ship after ship broke away from the Concord fleet. Some came to join the defense of Earth. Others simply disappeared into deep space rather than participate in what they saw as an act of galactic barbarism. "Ma'am," her communications officer reported, his voice filled with disbelief. "We're getting surrender broadcasts from 3 entire Concord battle groups. They're requesting permission to dock at our stations." But the real shock came when the entire world began declaring independence. The mining colonies of Kepler. For 38B, inspired by Foreman Jack Reynolds' discovery that the silicon-based life forms were actually highly intelligent, announced they were no longer part of the Concord. The agricultural worlds of the Vega system, tired of watching their food supplies shipped to the core worlds while their own children went hungry, closed their borders to Concord ships. The Ultrian rebels, who had been fighting a guerrilla war against Concord occupation for decades, watched the news from Earth with tears in their eyes. For the first time in generations, they saw proof that resistance was possible, that compassion could triumph over cruelty. Within days, they opened their borders to refugees from across the galaxy, creating safe havens for the displaced and the persecuted. The Centauri Collective, the Concord's most reliable ally, stunned the galaxy by announcing they would no longer participate in species-cleansing operations. Their representative, a dignified woman named Ambassador Torres, delivered the announcement with quiet fury. We have spent centuries telling ourselves that we were bringing order to chaos. But Earth has shown us that we were bringing chaos to order. Within months, the Free Worlds Alliance had grown from Earth and a handful of defectors to 47 separate species and star systems, all united by a single radical idea, that strength came not from dominating others, but from helping them flourish. Captain Zefkar, now Earth's ambassador to this growing alliance, stood in the UN General Assembly addressing representatives from dozens of worlds he'd never imagined could work together. The same Kethrin who had once watched his ships die in the cold darkness of space now looked out at a chamber filled with beings from every corner of the galaxy, all committed to building something better than what had come before. "The stars cast us out," he said, his voice carrying to every world in the Alliance through quantum communications arrays. "But Earth welcomed us home, and in doing so, lit a beacon that will guide the lost for generations to come." His words weren't just diplomatic rhetoric. Outside the UN building, human children played with Kethrin younglings in Central Park, their laughter echoing off buildings that now house the galaxy's first truly integrated civilization. Kids from 17 different species chased each other around playgrounds, speaking a mixture of languages that created entirely new forms of communication based on joy rather than conquest. 8-year-old Amy Peterson, the daughter of the doctor who had helped save so many Kethrin lives, was teaching her best friend Vorjak how to ride a bicycle. Neither of them cared that Vorjak had 4 arms instead of 2, or that his skin changed color when he was excited. They just cared about the simple pleasure of racing to the park together. 2 kids from different worlds sharing the universal language of friendship. The revolution had begun not with weapons or manifestos, but with a simple human concept that the galaxy had forgotten: kindness. And as the sun set over New York City, casting long shadows across a park where the children of a dozen worlds played together, it was clear that this revolution would succeed not because it was the strongest, but because it was the most human thing of all.